Okay, so hello and welcome everyone to my series of lecture videos on microeconomics. In today's slide deck, we're going to go over supply and demand, and this is going to be really foundational for a lot of the things we'll do for the rest of the course. The supply and demand model is really sort of the central model for introductory level microeconomics. And the goal of the slide deck is really to take some existing intuition that you have about how markets work and supply and demand just from living life to this point, and to make it a lot more rigorous. So when students come into their first economics class, usually they come with a lot of sort of insight into how markets work. I mean, at higher prices, consumers are going to be willing to buy less, and at lower prices, consumers are going to be willing to buy more. And at higher prices, you're going to have sellers that are going to be a lot more eager to bring a larger quantity to the market, and at lower prices, your sellers are going to be significantly less interested in bringing a large quantity to the market. So that existing intuition is exactly correct. Where trouble lies is you might be tempted to say that at higher prices, demand falls, and at lower prices, demand rises. And that's not the precise way to say it. As a matter of fact, that terminology is completely wrong. And the point of this lecture is to explain why that's the case. So, okay. So this week we are shifting our focus to think about markets using the supply and demand model. A market, just to be clear about what we're talking about, is any place where traders, producers, consumers are all coming together for exchange. So the supply and demand model is our economic model or framework that we're going to use to analyze specific markets. And so we'll focus on a market for one single good or one single service, and we'll take each good or service one at a time. So you have to redraw a graph for each additional market that you want to study. Okay, so when using the supply and demand model, we make some assumptions. The fundamental assumption is that the market is competitive. So what does that mean? Well, a competitive market is one where we've got a lot of buyers and sellers. And because there's so many, each individual's influence on the market as a whole is negligible. So no individual can influence the market by virtue of buying a large quantity or small quantity. No individual seller can swing the market price by virtue of bringing a large quantity or small quantity. And clearly this assumption does not make sense for all markets. And one of the important goals of economics and studying introductory level economics is to introduce the role of assumptions in our thinking and in our framework. So in economics, we try to make this very explicit. There's assumptions in every discipline and every way of thinking. We're not always so good at making clear what those assumptions are and what happens when we relax them. Okay, so the basic elements of the supply and demand model: we need a demand curve, so we'll talk about that. We need a supply curve. We need factors that shift each curve, that give us an increase or a decrease in supply or demand. We'll define a market equilibrium. That's the conditions of price and quantity where the market is balanced. So we'll define what that means, and then we'll think about comparative statics just a little bit. We'll think about how the market equilibrium adjusts when supply or demand change. Okay, so there's three important parts of terminology when it comes to demand, and this is sort of following exactly off of what I said initially to introduce today. So we have three important terms pertaining to demand. We have the demand schedule, we have quantity demanded, and we have the demand curve. So the demand schedule is a table. It's a table format that's going to give us all the combinations of price and quantity for a specific good or service. This is all the combinations of price and quantities reporting the information regarding what consumers want to buy at every price. We can depict the demand schedule graphically, and that's called a demand curve, and it's going to have exactly the same information. As a matter of fact, on my slides, I'm going to show your demand schedule and a demand curve side by side. Okay. And then the third definition, this is the one where people have a lot of trouble sometimes, is quantity demanded. So quantity demanded is the amount consumers wish to buy at a specific price. Matter of fact, when I was first introducing this, I said, hey, look, you want to say that at higher prices, demand falls. And I said, that's not correct. Well, the reason why it's not correct is that we'll say at higher prices, it's quantity demanded that falls. Okay, so let's sort of develop this idea. So here's my important point to terminology. When we use the term demand, we are typically referring to the entire demand curve, the entire demand schedule, the whole demand relationship. This is the relationship between price and quantity at every possible price, right? We're referring to the entire demand relationship, all the information about the buyer side of the market. If we are referring to the amount that buyers wish to buy at a specific price, then we're using the term quantity demanded. So quantity and price go close together. So for a given price, there's a specific quantity demanded. When we take all prices and all quantities demanded, that's what we call demand. So therefore, as a direct consequence of this sort of precision in our definition, when prices change, what we are studying is a change in quantity demanded, not a change in demand. So when prices change, when prices rise or fall, all that can change is quantity, right? So we get a rise in price, we get a fall in quantity demanded. We get a fall in price, we'll get a rise in quantity demanded. All the while, demand, the entire relationship, the relationship that binds consumer preferences and prices throughout, doesn't change. Demand doesn't change. What changes is we're moving along different points on that same demand curve. So then, okay, how do we get a change in demand? Well, to get a change in demand, we need something other than price to change. So some non-price factor has to change. And I'll talk about what these things are and give some examples. So we'll talk about this in greater detail in a little bit. Okay, so this is a demand curve versus a demand schedule. So on the left here, we have a demand curve. And then on the right, we have a demand schedule. And you will almost never see these things together. Usually you're given a demand schedule and need to construct a demand curve, or you're given a demand curve and you should implicitly think about the demand schedule behind it. But here, just to sort of introduce the topic, I've got the demand curve and then the corresponding demand schedule. So what this is saying is at a price of $6, the quantity demanded is 1. And we can see this either by virtue of looking at the graph or by virtue of looking at our demand schedule. At a price of 6, the quantity demanded is 1. If we change prices, if we move to a different price, say we go to $4.25, the quantity demanded falls from 1 or rises from 1 to 2. So we see this in the table as well. As price falls, it goes from 6 to 4.25, the quantity demanded rises from 1 to 2. And so on and so forth throughout our entire demand relationship. So what we mean by demand is this entire demand curve or this entire demand schedule. And either way, it contains the same information. Notice, so important part of sort of economic convention, the vertical intercept or the vertical axis is always price. And the vertical intercept is going to be the maximal price that consumers are willing to pay in a market. So I didn't draw this here. You imagine that this could go up and either connect to the vertical axis or it might be asymptotic. And same thing down here. So the horizontal axis is always quantity, and the horizontal intercept would correspond to the amount that would be demanded by consumers at a price of 0. So this would be like how much of that market you can give away, how much of that good you can give away in this market for free. That's what the horizontal intercept would be. It's not drawn on this picture. We don't need to worry about it. Okay, so here's a general observation. Demand curves slope downward, right? So if you see a down-sloping curve, even if it's unlabeled, like I haven't labeled this here, I could put demand right here. Demand curves slope downward. So this is just capturing your existing intuition that at higher prices, there's a smaller quantity that consumers want to buy. At lower prices, consumers want to buy a larger quantity. So this is what we call the law of demand. Law of demand just simply says a higher price reduces the quantity demanded, a lower price increases the quantity demanded. Ceteris paribus. So what does ceteris paribus mean? Ceteris paribus is, we introduced this earlier, it's sort of an important assumption we often make implicitly in economics. Sometimes we'll actually append this to the end of a statement, as I have here. Ceteris paribus means holding all other things constant, or other things equal. So what this means is, if price changes and nothing else changes, we expect to get a change in quantity that's predictable, according to the law of demand. If price has risen, we expect quantity is going to fall. If price falls, we expect quantity to rise, as long as nothing else has changed. Right? So we'll talk about some of those other things that could change a little bit. Now, assuming nothing else changes besides price, we trace our way up or down a single demand curve according to whether price has risen or fallen. So therefore, when prices change, we get a change in quantity demanded according to the law of demand. Right? The law of demand will tell us which way quantity should change in response to a given change in price. Okay, so we can actually illustrate a change in quantity demanded using our demand schedule or our demand curve. So notice that as price changes, the quantity demanded changes. So for example, if the price is $6, the quantity demanded is 1. If the price falls to 2, the quantity demanded changes to 5. right? So let's look at the picture. Let's start at a price of 6, see that the quantity demanded is 1, then we'll assume prices fall into $2, and we'll look and see, sure enough, quantity demanded will rise to 5. So here this is on our picture. Imagine initially price is $6, the quantity demanded is 1. Now suppose the price falls from $6 to $2, quantity demanded will go to 5, and we're going to move down the single demand curve. It's not a change in demand, it's just a change in quantity demanded, so we're going to remain on the same demand curve, move all the way down to 5 or up to 5 units. Down the curve, increase going up in quantity, right? Same thing we can see with the demand schedule. As price falls from $6 to $2, quantity demanded rises from 1 to 5. Okay. So changes in quantity demanded are movements along the demand curve, right? Movements up or down a single demand curve. That's what we mean by a change in quantity demanded. So what this means is when prices change, we move from our original quantity demanded to some other quantity demanded, all while remaining on the same demand curve. So that's what I was demonstrating before. So price change from 6 to 2, we're going to find our new quantity demanded along that same demand curve. It's a movement along a single demand curve. So equivalently, when prices change, we move up and down the quantity demanded column in the demand schedule, right? So if prices change, we can move up or down the same quantity demanded column in the demand schedule. Later on, I'll show what happens when we have a change in demand, and that'll give us a shift to the demand curve. And if you could visualize this demand curve moving to the right by 2 units everywhere, it'd be a rightward shift. And the way that this would be represented, the way that I'll show this in the demand schedule, is I'll just add another column, another quantity demanded column, and every quantity will be increased by 2. And that's how we would show a change in demand. So that's yet to come. Okay, so but first, just to further reinforce, a change in quantity demanded is a movement along the curve. So when prices decrease from P1 to P2, the quantity demanded increases from Q1 to Q2, move down the curve. If price increases from P2 to P1, quantity demanded decreases from Q2 to Q1. How do we know that P1's bigger than P2? And how do we know that Q2 is bigger than Q1? This point right here is 0, right? This is the origin. This point is 0. So larger quantities are to the right, larger prices are up. Okay, so sometimes some other important factor in the market besides price will change. We'll call these non-price factors or demand shifters. So when that happens, we get a change in demand. So changes in demand are represented by a rightward or leftward shift of the demand curve. So an increase in demand is represented by a rightward shift. A decrease in demand is represented by a leftward shift. So an increase in demand is represented by a rightward shift of the demand curve. That's the top arrow, going from demand A to demand C, for instance. And a decrease in demand is represented by a leftward shift in the demand curve, the bottom arrow, going from demand C to demand A. And here I have drawn my demand shifts as parallel shifts, right? So we're moving, our new demand curve is exactly parallel, or as close as I could get it, to the initial demand. That doesn't have to happen. You can have non-parallel shifts. You could get a different slope of the demand curve after the shift. That's not something we're going to make a big deal of in the introductory level, so don't worry too much about that. There's actually, without loss of generality, we are safe with parallel shifts at this level. Okay, so a change in demand is represented by a change in quantity demanded at each price. And this is important. This is a really important statement to develop your intuition about the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. So a change in demand means we have gotten a change in quantity demanded at every single price, right? So if we get a change in quantity demanded, that is a change due to we have one price changing to a new price. That's a change in quantity demanded. To get a change in demand, we need a new quantity demanded for every single price. So we'll see this graphically and then in the demand schedule. So to model an increase in demand, we need a higher quantity demanded at every price. To model a decrease in demand, we need a lower quantity demanded at every price. So here's a change in demand, a change in quantity demanded at every price. So a change in demand indicates a change in quantity demanded at every single price. It's important to say that a million times. So in this case, quantity demanded changes by 2 units at every price. Now I say change, I don't say the direction. We could either go from the blue curve to the green or from the green curve to the blue curve. I apologize for the Seattle Seahawks colors. And right, so if we go from the blue curve to the green curve, just look at what's happening at the price of $6. We go from a quantity demanded of 1 to a quantity demanded of 3. We see this indicated by my demand schedule. Or we can see this on the curve, right? We went from a quantity, or on the graph, we can go this, at the price of 6, we go from a quantity demanded of 1 to a quantity demanded of 3. And then as a matter of fact, we go down to a price of $4.25, we get a new quantity demanded at a price of $4.25 when we go to the green curve. Right? We go from 2 to what looks like about 4. Yeah, we go from 2 to 4. And so on and so forth. At every price, we got a new quantity demanded. That is a change in demand. And this could be an increase or a decrease in demand depending on, are we going from the blue curve to the green curve, or from the green curve to the blue curve. And we can see this represented in the table format in our demand schedule. So, when we get a new quantity demanded at every single price, we have a shift in demand, a change in demand. All right. So now, what can cause such a thing? In order to get a change in demand, we have to have something other than price change. So why? Well, that's because we need something that's going to be strong enough, something significant enough to give us a new quantity demanded at every single price. So this is going to be things like a change in the price of related goods or services. This could be a change in consumer income. This could be a change in consumer tastes or beliefs. This could be a change in expectations about future prices. This could be a change in the number of consumers. So all these things, these do not involve price, except for this one. But this does not involve price of the good we're considering. This is the price of some other related good that's changed. So let me talk about this logic. I'm going to introduce a couple important definitions, substitutes and complements. So the changes in the price of related goods refers to what happens in markets, other markets that might be relevant. So substitutes are those goods or services that could be used in place of the one we're focusing on. So for substitutes, I like to think about things like Coke and Pepsi. So an increase in the price of a substitute will increase the demand for the good under consideration. If we get an increase in the price of Coke, we expect that's going to increase the demand for Pepsi. If we get a decrease in the price of a substitute, that'll decrease the demand for the good under consideration. If we get a decrease in the price of Coke, we're going to expect that's going to cause a decrease in the demand for Pepsi. Now, in the good itself, in the market for the good for the good of the substitute good, suppose we get an increase in the price of Coke. Well, that's going to cause a decrease in quantity demanded for Coke, but for Pepsi, that's going to cause an increase in demand. At every single price, whatever is the current price of Pepsi, at every single price, people are going to be willing to buy more Pepsi if the price of Coke rises. Right? Okay. Changes in the price of related goods could also be complements. So complements are goods or services used together. In the classroom, my favorite complements are left shoes and right shoes, right? Left shoes and right shoes are used together for a pair of shoes. An increase in the price of a complement will decrease the demand for whatever is the good under consideration. A decrease in the price of a complement will increase the demand for the good under consideration. And the reason why is because these are goods used together. So you could think about things like hot dogs and hot dog buns, right? So if the price of hot dogs goes up, there's going to be a lower quantity demanded of hot dogs. There's also going to be a decrease in demand for hot dog buns because you're not going to need hot dog buns because you're not buying hot dogs, right? So here the price increase of a complement decreases the demand for the good under consideration and decreases the quantity demanded for the complement. To be really specific, a decrease in the price of a complement will increase the demand for the good under consideration. So if the price of hot dogs falls, we're going to get an increase in quantity demanded of hot dogs, which means we're going to need more hot dog buns. So regardless the price of hot dog buns, at every single price, we're going to get an increase in quantity demanded of hot dog buns. And because we're getting that at every single price, that is an increase in demand. Okay. All right, so changes in income matter because this affects how much people are willing to spend. So we have two important classifications of goods. This is another collection of important definitions. So normal goods and inferior goods. Normal goods are those for which the demand increases when income rises. So as your income rises, if you buy more of that type of good, we consider that good to be a normal good. Inferior goods are those for which demand decreases when income increases. So as your income rises, you buy less. So my example would be, fresh vegetables are a normal good. As your income rises, people buy more fresh vegetables. Also, as their income rises, you buy fewer canned vegetables, right? Canned vegetables would be an inferior good, probably for most people. Okay. Changes in taste are a demand shifter. Can shift demand left or right, increase in demand or decrease in demand. And this can be fads, beliefs, news reports. If there's a health report about some good being favorable to your health, we'll expect that to cause an increase in demand for that good. It can go in the opposite direction. So think about what's happened to tobacco, right? Consumer preferences, tastes, and beliefs, cultural aspects have shifted against tobacco. We get a leftward shift to the demand curve, other things equal, for tobacco. Okay. Changes in expectations matter. So if people believe the price of gasoline is going to rise in a week, people might increase the amount that they buy today at every single possible price. So if we believe gas prices are rising in a week or in a month, we're going to get a rightward shift of demand today. We're going to get an increase in demand today. And then lastly, changes in the number of buyers creates a direct change in the size of the market. So if the population increases or decreases, now you've got more people willing and able to buy the good at every single price. That's an increase in demand. So we get a different quantity demanded at every single price. We model this with a shift, right? If we get more people in the market or fewer people in the market, then we're going to get a larger or smaller according to whether it's a population increase or decrease at all prices. And that's a shift. That's a change in demand. Okay, so those were our demand shifters. Now let's talk about supply. So there's important terminology when it comes to supply. The quantity supplied is the actual amount of a good or service people are willing to sell at some given price. Supply schedule shows how much of a good or service would be supplied at different prices, and supply curve shows the relationship between quantity supplied and price. These are exactly analogous to what we did with demand, right? We had demand, we had quantity demanded, and we had demand schedule, demand curve. Just like that, we have the same thing for supply. The intuition is very similar. So here is our supply curve. It's a graphical representation of the supply relationship. Here's the supply schedule. It's a table format of the supply relationship. And notice at higher prices, we get a higher quantity supplied. Sellers like high prices. And we see this depicted either in the graphical format. So if we go from a price of $2, the quantity supplied is 1, to a price of $6 where the quantity supplied is 5. We can see this in the table as well. If we go from a $2 price, the quantity supplied is 1. The price of $6, quantity supplied is 5. Okay. So just as with demand and quantity demanded, we represent changes in quantity supplied as a movement along a single supply curve. So in order to get a change in quantity supplied, we need only price to change, right? If prices change, the only thing that can change is quantity. Now, if we're talking about the supply relationship, we're talking about sellers, the relevant change when prices change comes through quantity supplied. So as price increases, we move up the supply curve. As price decreases, we move down the supply curve. We can see this graphically. We kind of did that already. Let me show this again. If prices increase, we get an increase in quantity supplied. So when price increases from P1 to P2, we get an increase in quantity supplied from Q1 to Q2. When price decreases from P2 to P1, we're following this downward arrow, and we go from quantity supplied 2 to quantity supplied 1. Decrease in quantity supplied. That's a movement along the supply curve. So once again, just like with demand, if we want to get a change in supply, we need something that's going to change the quantity supplied at all prices. So we represent a change in supply as a rightward or leftward shift. We need something besides price, some non-price factor that's sufficiently strong to generate a new quantity supplied at each and every price. And we can see this with the supply schedule as well as graphically. So let's do that. So first, here's what we mean by an increase in supply. It's a top arrow. We'd go from supply A to supply C. Right? Increase in supply is a rightward shift. And a decrease in supply is represented by this bottom arrow. So we'd be going from supply C to supply A. And to make this happen, at every single price, we're getting a new quantity supplied. So this means we've got to have something besides price changing to cause this leftward or rightward shift of supply. So here is the analogous depiction of the situation that I showed with demand. Now with supply, if we go from the blue to the green, and again, apologies for Seattle Seahawks colors, I'm actually not a fan of them at all, other than former coach Holmgren and current quarterback Russell Wilson. So anyway, change in supply indicates a change in quantity supplied at every single price. In this case, quantity supplied is changing by 3 units at all prices. Okay, so here we go from a price of $6 from quantity supplied of 5 to a quantity supplied of 8, right? And if we are going from the blue curve to the green curve, we go from a price of $2 and a quantity of $1 so we get a new quantity supplied when we move to this new curve. Whereas previously at the price of $2, their quantity supplied had been 1. Now our price corresponding, our quantity supplied corresponding to the price of $2 is 4. So we get an increase in quantity supplied of 3 at all possible prices. That's a shift in demand. Or if we take the opposite perspective, if we're going from the green curve to the blue curve, we get a decrease in quantity supplied at every price. And so that would be a leftward shift from green to blue. Oh, and the coach I was referring to is, of course, Mike Holmgren, who had been coach of the Packers. Okay, so as mentioned, in order to get a change in supply, we need to have something other than price change. That's because we need something strong enough to change the quantity supplied at all prices. So this includes changes in input prices, changes in the price of related goods or services, which happens through, the way this happens is through a mechanism which might not be what you're expecting. Change in technology and a change in expectations, change in number of producers. All of these will shift the supply curve. Okay, so a change in input prices. Basically, this changes the cost of productions. And wouldn't you know, so this is important, so the height of the supply curve is actually corresponding to the costs for sellers. Height of the supply curve is the cost for sellers. So naturally, if input prices change, if they rise or fall, this affects the cost to produce any quantity. So that's why we can get a shift in the curve. So for example, if the price of jet fuel rises, we're going to expect the quantity supplied to fall at all prices because costs have risen at all prices. So we get a leftward shift of the supply curve in the market for flights. All right, so a change in the price of related goods or services affects supply. So producers have options of what to build. So let's see how a change in the price, the market price of a good or service, can affect the supply of the good or service under consideration. So consider Apple. If the price of iPods falls, Apple's going to decrease the quantity supplied of iPods. Right, the market price falls. What can change? Only quantity supplied. So if the price of iPods falls, Apple's going to reduce the quantity supplied of iPods and instead use, which are largely essentially the same components, to make iPhones, right? So we'd get an increase in the supply of iPhones. Regardless of the market price of iPhones, we'd expect at all possible prices, we're going to increase the quantity supplied of iPhones. That's a rightward shift of the curve corresponding to iPhones, right? So Apple, the same components largely are used for iPods, iPads, iPhones. If the market price of one of those changes, suppose it falls, Apple's going to pull those resources out of making that as many of that particular products. We're going to get a decrease in quantity supplied corresponding to the market where the price has fallen, and we're going to move those resources and increase our supply of the other product. So price of iPods falls, we're going to make fewer iPods, decrease in quantity supplied, but we get an increase in supply for iPhones. Okay, so a change in technology affects costs, right? And if it affects costs, that's going to affect the height of the demand of the supply curve at every single price. So suppose production costs are affected, this affects supply curve. If technology improves, we expect an increase in supply, a rightward shift. If technology is lost or destroyed, maybe we have a hurricane or something, we expect supply to decrease, a leftward shift. Changes in expectations. So this can affect how much is sold today in favor of what might be sold in the future. So grain producers, pay attention to the price of corn, which is somewhat storable. when determining how much to bring to the market immediately and whether to wait in the case that maybe prices would rise. So if you expect prices to fall several months in the future, we'll increase the supply today. If we expect prices to rise at some point in the future, we'll decrease the supply today, just sell in the future. So this is most relevant for goods that are storable and non-perishable. Okay. Changes in the number of producers affects the quantity offered at every single price. If there's more producers, we expect there's a greater amount supplied, larger quantity supplied at all prices. If there's fewer producers, we expect the quantity supplied to decrease at all prices. So this is represented by a leftward or rightward shift to the supply curve. And this is actually going to be super relevant later on when we're considering the competitive market and consider entry and exit and the effect on the equilibrium price in a competitive market. And so we'll see if a large number of firms enter or exit a competitive market, this can shift the market supply curve, which will affect the market equilibrium, which will be relevant for the individual firm that we're studying. So this is something I always tell my students, kind of put an asterisk next to this, so we come back to this in a couple weeks. So that's going to be the link back to this supply shifter. Okay, so we had a general principle that markets like to move towards equilibrium. So what does equilibrium mean? Well, we have a very specific definition. This is where the quantity supplied exactly equals the quantity demanded. And we represent this graphically as the point where the two curves cross. So where the supply curve and demand curve meet, that is our market equilibrium. And to specify a market equilibrium, we actually need a pair. We need a price and we need a quantity. So the equilibrium involves the price that makes it possible for quantity supplied to equal quantity demanded, as well as that particular quantity, which is called the equilibrium quantity. So you'll notice I denote quantity supplied as Q sub S, and I denote quantity demanded as Q sub D. And that's a pretty standard convention across a lot of economics classes. Okay, so here's our market equilibrium depicted graphically. So we have our demand curve, the exact same demand curve from earlier. We have our supply curve, exact same supply curve from earlier. You notice I put this label for demand curve. I did not label supply curve. There should be no confusion. All demand curves that we're going to see are downsloping. All supply curves that we're going to see are upsloping. Or horizontal. We'll discuss that in slides to come. Okay, so here's our market schedule. So we have the quantity demanded in blue. We have our quantity supplied in green. And we'll see, our equilibrium is where the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded. So our equilibrium price is $3 and our equilibrium quantity is 3. Let's find this on the graph. Sure. Our equilibrium price is $3. Our equilibrium quantity is 3. And then you'll notice, this is a really important property, at above equilibrium prices, at prices that are higher than equilibrium, what do you think happens? Well, sellers like higher prices better than buyers. So we're going to expect that the quantity supplied at higher prices than equilibrium is going to be larger than quantity demanded. And sure enough, let's take 425, let's go over. Here's our quantity demanded, it's only 2. And if we move down here to our supply curve, our quantity supplied is 4. And then at below equilibrium prices, buyers like lower prices better than sellers. So at the price of $2, our quantity supplied is only 1, but our quantity demanded is 5. And we can see this in the table. If this is the equilibrium at higher prices, the quantity supplied is going to be bigger than the quantity demanded. And at lower prices, the quantity demanded is going to be bigger than the quantity supplied. Right, so if you're given an equilibrium price and you're asked what happens at a price that's above the equilibrium price, say the equilibrium price is $3 and I say, tell me, is there a shortage or a surplus? Shortage or a surplus at a price of $10? Well, all you need to do is reason who likes the higher price better. It's sellers. So that's going to tell us we're going to have a larger quantity supplied than quantity demanded. When quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded, there's a surplus. There is more in the market available to buy than there are buyers standing ready to buy. What about below equilibrium prices? Suppose the good is free. I like the really extreme one, right? Suppose the equilibrium price is 3, but the price is free, $0. Well, buyers love free. Sellers probably not as much. So the quantity demanded is going to exceed the quantity supplied. And when there's a larger quantity demanded, when buyers want to buy more than exists in the market, that's a definition of a shortage. So, okay, so let's make that more rigorous with some definitions. The market equilibrium occurs where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. At other prices, there's disparity between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So if quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied, we say there's a shortage. That's where quantity demanded is larger than quantity supplied. That's a shortage. We can see how big a shortage is. So at the price of $2, what's our shortage? Well, quantity demanded is 5, quantity supplied is 1. There's a shortage of 4, right? The shortfall. There's a quantity of 4 above and beyond what's available in the market. Quantity demanded of 5, quantity supplied is 1, so the shortfall is 4. The shortage is 4. Okay, so if quantity demanded is smaller than the quantity supplied, we say there's a surplus. So this is where QD is smaller than QS. Okay, so we can quantify that surplus. So here, at a price of $6, we actually have a surplus of 4, right? So quantity supplied is 5, quantity demanded is 1. There's 4 extra units, right? There's 4 units beyond what consumers are willing to buy at the price of 6. So we'd say the surplus is 4 here. What's the shortage or surplus here? In equilibrium, it's 0, right? Because quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, so 3 minus 3 is 0, right? So there's neither a shortage or a surplus. That's exactly what we get in equilibrium, right? There's no buyers that are unserved or sellers that are unable to find buyers in equilibrium, at the equilibrium price. Okay, so since we've assumed markets have a tendency towards equilibrium, we assume if there's a disparity between quantity demanded and quantity supplied, in the event of a shortage, the price needs to rise. Then quantity demanded falls, quantity supplied rises, and the market clears. Right? So if the price is too low, the price has to rise, come back to equilibrium. This discourages buyers from purchasing. This encourages sellers to increase the quantity supplied, and the market comes into balance. In the event of a surplus, the price is too high. The price needs to fall. So the quantity demanded rises, buyers are encouraged to re-enter the market or to purchase. Quantity supplied falls as price falls, and the market ultimately clears. Okay, so this concludes this set of slides.